This explanation of pagan religion by Girard, then, begs an important question. Why is Girard a Christian? Prima facie, Christianity perfectly conforms to this logic that he attributed to false pagan religions, right? There's civil unrest in Jerusalem, where Christ eventually gets crucified. There's obviously Christ's unjust scapegoating and murder on the cross. There's the resurrection and divinization. There's the mythologization through the Bible. And then there's the institutionalization through the Catholic Church and many of its prohibitions and rituals. The question is this: how can the Christian story be true for Girard, but the pagan religions be false? Girard's answer is that the Christian story is indeed going to have the same structure as pagan religion because Christ is going to be scapegoated. But there's one crucial difference. Christianity will be the first story told from the perspective of the victim. Remember, pagan myth always sides with the murderers. It always believes in the guilt of its victims. Sophocles' telling of Oedipus affirms the judgment of Thebes, that Oedipus was indeed responsible for the plague because of his patricide and incest. Or take the founding murder of the Roman Republic, that of Romulus and Remus, where Romulus kills Remus to establish Rome. The canonical telling here, again, paints the killing as, however regrettable, as justified by Remus's hubris and transgression from ignoring Romulus's city's boundaries. What the Bible is doing then is to tell the same type of story as pagan religion, but from the other perspective. Not the perspective of the persecutor, which all pagan religion has been told from, but the victim. I mean, think about it. What does the Bible tell us? He tells us that Christ is not guilty. Even his sentencer, Pontius Pilate, declares his innocence. The mob that convicts Christ is shown to be arbitrary, the true source of evil. The sentencing of Christ is depicted as unjust through and through, with the charges against Christ nothing more than psychological projections by the crowd. This is what that story tells us. And of course, the whole story is written down and told to us by the disciples, the side of the victim and not the persecutor. Christianity tells the story of scapegoating, but from the opposite, truthful side. We are like jurors who have been hearing the criminal's lies for so long in pagan religion, suddenly exposed to the truth of the victim's testimony. The crucifixion exposes the lies of all religions to show that the mob is deceitful, the victim is innocent. There's no sacred pagan power that is merely projection. This is the fundamental, resounding message that comes out of the crucifixion for Girard. And it is a message that will expose and begin to tear down the scapegoat mechanism, slowly but surely. From this moment on, we will be reading myths in the light of the Gospels, which allows us to see through their lies. Christ's innocence and unjust persecution through the proliferation of Christianity becomes the dominant lens through which we will view the world from then on. We will always be looking out for unjust persecution. We will always be siding with the victim. We will always be aware of the deceitfulness of the mob. Christ knows that reason alone, that an analytical articulation of the scapegoat mechanism like the one I just provided you, is not enough to shake societies out of this perennial cultural practice. What we need is an equally compelling story that shakes us into a radically new mode of seeing the world.
To your point, I'm always surprised by how much of our secular world is grounded on Christian concepts. I think of the Protestant work ethic, our concern for victims, human rights,
Yeah, and this is how powerful the Christian story is. We are all, in a sense, living in a Christian paradigm, even if we're not explicitly Christians, because Christianity grounds the fundamental philosophical intuitions of modernity. Christianity, then, for Girard, is the religion to end all religions, the myth to end all myths, the founding murder to end all founding murders, by exposing their violent, unjust, and deceitful origins. The right metaphor to think about Christianity and pagan religion, then, is the relationship between a vaccine and the original disease. The efficacy of a vaccine to neutralize the original disease lies in its proximity, not its radical difference, right? Structurally, the COVID vaccine is very similar to the original COVID disease, just with a few tweaks. And it's that similarity is what makes it an effective COVID vaccine and not like a polio vaccine, for example. The Bible, then, for Girard, is a myth vaccine. And so, the strategy of many modern Christians to show that the Bible has nothing to do with the myths of yore, that it is radically different, is misguided. I mean, take the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first known myths of Mesopotamia. Modern Christians blush at the similarities between this myth and the Bible, right? There's a quest for a fruit of immortality from the tree of eternal life. These are things that both exist in the Bible as well as the myth of Gilgamesh. There's a deceitful snake eating a fruit and robbing us of our immortality. And there's also great floods from which the chosen are protected. Girard would say, look, don't blush and don't try to distance the Bible from these myths. The Bible is effective because and not despite of its proximity to myths. The Bible is a Trojan horse that frees us from pagan religion from within. Girard's surprising conclusion is that Christianity is a demystifying force here to end all religions. The Christian moral paradigm takes away the core foundational bedrock of all early human societies. Slowly but surely, Christianity allows us to decode and escape from the scapegoat mechanism, which cannot function if people know that the victim is innocent. If the victim is shown to be innocent, then catharsis cannot be achieved. Without catharsis, there's no peace. Without peace, there's no deification. Without deification, pagan worldly institutions lose their prestige, and without prestige, they can no longer properly function. Christianity takes humanity out of cyclical time, demarcated by these relativistic moral paradigm shifts, and accelerates us towards a linear trajectory. Now, the direction of this linearity is defined by 4 key forces that Christ lets loose on human history: love, truth, innovation, and surprisingly, Girard thinks, violence. As with all things Girard, even his analysis on the worldly effects of Christianity are deeply ambivalent. Within this Pandora's box of forces that Christ has just let loose on human history, we have the good, love, truth, innovation, but also the apocalyptic, violence. They are both growing and have broken free all at the same time. What's more, even within these individual forces, Girard's analysis is deeply ambivalent. Love often manifests as hypocrisy. Truth becomes dogma, and innovation degenerates into fashion. And even in violence, Girard sees a key motivational force that has brought forth the most enviable living conditions of man when channeled productively through capitalism. Let's examine each of these forces in turn. The first force that Christianity unleashes on history is love. Love is the force that has made all of our institutions like law so much more humane. It's the force that sees developed nations competing for the prestige of helping troubled nations. It's the force that has freed us from cruel practices of human sacrifice and bloody rituals. It's the force underpinning the modern political ideals of human rights and equality. Girard believes that Christ is responsible for all of this because that was his key message: renounce violence, turn the other cheek, develop love, love thy neighbor as thyself. We are so concerned with the poor and the dispossessed these days, we naturally side with victims in the same way that pagan societies might have sided with the strong, because Christ's story is about the innocence and the moral purity of victims. Culturally, we are radically different from pagan society, with their worship of power and disregard for the weak, but in some sense, stubborn human nature still refuses to budge. Girard thinks we still need to persecute, but the only acceptable way to persecute is now in the name of victims, in the name of stopping persecution. In a way then, Girard isn't convinced society has really changed that much at all, that we've really given up persecution. Rather, perhaps the better reading is that it's a mere superficial switch of who we think it's acceptable to persecute. Because of our victim-concerned culture, anyone who looks like a traditional victim is completely off limits. Ethnic minorities, the lower classes, women, the disabled, and Girard thinks that's a great thing. But the problem is that we've flipped it on its head. Now we feel warranted, nay, maybe even compelled, to persecute all types of privilege. White privilege, ableist privilege, class privilege, male privilege. Girard has this to say, I'll give you a quote: "Our society's obligatory compassion authorizes new forms of cruelty," end quote. Girard accuses modernity of hypocrisy, and he reminds us of the terrible atrocities committed in the name of protecting victims. Let me give you another quote. Hypocrisy is dangerous then because it leads to what it claims to prevent, the persecution of victims. Anyone familiar with the tragedies of the Soviet Union grounded on protection of the victimized proletariat should look at America's caught up in victimhood ideology with trembling fear. This other totalitarianism, this inquisition in the name of victims, is the form that arbitrary, unjustified violence takes place today, the persecution of persecutors. End quote. Now, that's love. And the same ambivalent story could be told for the second force of Christianity, truth. Girard asks us to look around in the modern world. More so than any almost other civilization, we value truth and believe in our ability to obtain it. Far are we from the Garden of Eden's prohibitions against the tree of knowledge. Far are we from the intellectual humilities of Job. Far are we from the lessons from Oedipus that knowing more can lead to disaster. And far are we from witch hunts and superstitions. Perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, Girard takes the crowning achievement of truth, science, to be engendered by Christianity. This might seem ridiculous, but let me give you a first pass at his argument. Christianity paved the way for scientific inquiry by expelling myth and clearing the ground, as it were. This should already be a familiar idea at this point. Christianity exposes the deceitfulness of worldly foundations and begins to tear down prohibitions, rituals, and all pagan religions. And it is only when we cease to look for truth in myth does reason even have the fertile ground to bear the fruits of truth. After all, if something is already explained by a wildly prestigious myth that is fatal to question, then reason will not even want to begin to investigate it. Girard's interlocutor sums up his view quite nicely here. Let me quote again. It is really Christianity that makes science possible by desacralizing the real, by freeing people from magical causalities. Once we stop seeing storms as being triggered by the machinations of the witch across the street, we start being able to study meteorological phenomenon scientifically. End quote. Now, I need to say a lot more, and I will, to convince you of this point. But before we celebrate too early, the same problem with love occurs with truth. Just as the protection of victims is the banner which persecutors rally under, we love science so much that we have fetishized it into an unquestionable religion. But what's the problem with science gaining an immense prestige? What's wrong with that? Girard's answer is this. By being deified, science can become unquestionable, which can silence opposing voices and justify terrible political agendas. Think about Malthus in the 18th century. He reasoned that living standards would go back to subsistence because population growth grows geometrically while food increases arithmetically. Now, in the 1970s, there was a whole wave of ridiculous climate science championed by the Times, the New York Review, Columbia, Brown. They were publishing articles about an inevitable ice age that just seems ludicrous from today's perspective. And of course, the terrors of the Nazis were justified on the latest science of the day, eugenics. Far from a pseudoscience, eugenics enjoyed enormous prestige in the early 20th century. It was grounded on Darwin, the latest evolutionary biology of the day, and responsible for the development of statistics. There was a University College London chair of eugenics, in the same way there might be a chair for biology today. And eugenics was supported by Nobel laureates like Hermann Muller and political leaders like Theodore Roosevelt. So I hope the problem of deifying science is clear. Girard thinks the reason that it is dangerous to deify science is the same reason it was dangerous to deify edicts of the Catholic Church. Just as the bloody European conquest of the Americas was, at least partially, legitimized through the appeal to Catholicism as spreading the gospel, today we too legitimize our often questionable political pursuits with just a sprinkle of reason and a little dab of science. And just as whomever used to disagree with the Catholic Church we called heretics, we call those today who disagree with politically charged, questionable science as anti-science, someone whose positions we don't even have to contend with. When deified, science becomes a blocker to truth and genuine inquiry because it becomes a conversation stopper. Therein lies the the hypocrisy. Now, the third force of Christianity is innovation, and it has been engendered by Christ in a very similar way that science was. By tearing down myths, we are freed from an exaggerated idolation of the past, and we are enabled, empowered to imagine its future. The idea that Girard has in mind here might be better approximated by thinking about the negative case. What is certainly not conducive to innovation is the reactionary idea, not uncommon throughout most of history. Most famously, perhaps, among the Confucians and perhaps many Christians, that our best days are behind us, right? And such a view lends to the practical orientation that the best we can do is to blindly imitate the past and press the brakes on the downward trajectory of history. Now, under such a worldview, the very word innovation had negative connotations in the West up until the 18th century. Its connotations were negative because innovation implied a deviation from a sacred, albeit static and rigid ideal, provided to us by the myths of yore. Innovation before the 18th century was synonymous with heresy. Now, such an exaggerated respect of the past is often grounded on a religious belief in a mythologized past. Christianity frees us from this blind worship because it is a force, according to Girard, of course, that tears down mythologization. It reveals to us what we once thought of as immutable, as arbitrary, so we are free to experiment and innovate.
One of the surprising things that I've seen is this weird anti-correlation between mythologizing the past and innovation. And I started to get this hunch when I would spend time around Silicon Valley types, and you have dinner with them and they boast about their knowledge of the world. But then you start talking to them about the history of their own industry, and it's not something that they think or talk about a lot. And I compare that to the people I've met in the oil industry or the finance industry, these older and more established industries, where the people who I meet there, they know the history of their industries cold. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting observation that there is a negative correlation between how innovative an industry or a person is against how much they know about history, or at least seem to respect it.
Yes.
And I think Girard would say that the difference between the tech industry and the oil industry is the same difference between modernity and pagan society, that we are much less idolatrous and concerned with the past, and as a result, much more oriented towards the future due to Christianity. Now, as we are freed from the grips of the past, innovation has brought about drastic technological and social change. Clearly, if you just look around our world, right, there's the mastery of travel and land, air, and sea. There's the victory over disease and starvation, the political systems, gender norms, money. Western civilization, at least in the past few hundred years, is defined by and prides itself with change. Now, the problem with innovation is the same problem with love and truth, hypocrisy. We've now fetishized innovation. We are conforming to contrarianism. We are obediently rallying under the banner of originality. Girard has this to say. It's so good that I'll quote it in full. The modern world rejects imitation in favor of originality at all costs. You should never say what others are saying, never paint what others are painting, never think what others are thinking, and so on. Since this is absolutely impossible, there soon emerges a negative imitation that sterilizes everything. More and more, often they're obliged to turn their coats inside out and with great fanfare announce some new epistemological rupture that is supposed to revolutionize the field from top to bottom. This rage for originality has produced a few rare masterpieces and quite a few rather bizarre things. The principle of originality at all costs leads to paralysis. The more we celebrate creative and enriching innovations, the fewer of them there are. For 2,000 years, the arts have been imitative, and it's only in the 19th and 20th century that people started refusing to be mimetic. Why? Because we're more mimetic than ever. Rivalry plays a role such that we strive vainly to exercise imitation, end quote. The problem that Girard is identifying here with categorically rejecting imitation and idolizing innovation is that imitation and meaningful innovation are often inseparable. You need to imitate and gain mastery first before you can make any real innovations. History is littered with examples where repetition, replication, imitation is a necessary precondition for innovation. Think about Goethe, who was a master of reproduction, reproducing the great poetic forms before he pioneered his own. Think about the industrial powers that started off as mere copycats, but grew into innovators in their own right. Let me read Girard again. It began with Germany, which in the 19th century was thought to be at most capable of imitating the English. And this at the precise moment it surpassed them. It continued with the Americans, in whom, for a long time, the Europeans saw mediocre gadget makers who weren't theoretical or cerebral enough to take on a world leadership role. And it happened once more with the Japanese, who after World War II were still seen as pathetic imitators of Western superiority. It's starting up again, it seems, with Korea, and soon, perhaps, it'll be the Chinese. All of these consecutive mistakes about the creative potential of imitation cannot be due to chance. End quote. Girard's point here is that by fetishizing contrarianism, innovation, originality, and by rejecting repetition, replication, imitation, we paradoxically doom ourselves to never make any meaningful innovations whatsoever, because innovation is dependent on imitation. Now, as you can see, even the three quote-unquote good forces of modernity are deeply ambivalent. Culture has fundamentally changed. There's never been a society as loving, truthful, and innovative as ours. But stubborn human nature refuses to budge. We still need to persecute, to deify, and to conform. And so, the perversities of modernity, for Girard, all take on the shape of hypocrisy. Persecution under the banner of protecting victims. Rigid adherence to scientific dogmas under the guise of free intellectual exploration. The most derivative of imitations, packaged as radical innovations. The metaphor, then, that best captures this radical break as well as stubborn continuity is a just-launched rocket struggling to reach escape velocity. I mean, think about it. Such a rocket is clearly a radical break from it was stationary, but it is also in a continuity because it is still governed by the pull of gravity. The same, perhaps, can be said for the point of history that we're in now. There's a clear radical break between our culture that protects victims and all the ones that have come before, which made them into scapegoats. But the stubborn gravitational pull of the human condition remains the same. We still need to persecute and find victims to blame. It's this tension between cultural advancement and the constancy of human nature that plagues modernity for Girard. Now, our rocket ship of modernity is already in trouble, but the fourth and final force of Christianity will send it crashing towards the ground: violence. You may be surprised that Girard conceived of violence as one of the forces coming out of Christ defeating the scapegoat mechanism. But given Girard's understanding of how worldly peace is brought about, this conclusion, in some sense, should flow quite naturally. After all, if worldly order, a peaceful society, is founded on a deceitful, violent act of catharsis, then truth and love, which Christianity has unleashed, must be threatening, if not harmful, for this foundation. Right? The scapegoat mechanism is a deeply morally ambivalent process for Girard. It is deceitful, it is wrong, but it's also so damn effective. Just a single innocent man has to be murdered for the entire community to be saved. Sacrifice one for the peace of all. Limit the freedom of the parts for the stability of the whole. And so, we might say, in a highly reductive fashion, that the scapegoat mechanism is a worldly good, but ultimate evil, whereas Christ is ultimately good, but brings forth worldly destruction. Girard constantly reminds us that Christ himself says as much. Matthew 10:34, Christ has this to say: "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." Christ's sword is aimed at the scapegoat mechanism, which lies at the foundation of worldly order. Now, while the consequences of the Christian revelation for Girard are violent and destructive, Christ's intentions surely are not. Christ did not cut down the worldly order for the sake of cutting down worldly order, but only so we may be freed from violence and lies, such that we can love each other. Christ took off our training wheels so that we may be freed, yet we've simply fallen and stumbled. Without the scapegoat mechanism, we no longer have our old prohibitions to stop metaphysical desires from running rampant, nor do we have sacrificial rituals to bring about catharsis. So, to put in other words, we've lost both our tools to prevent and resolve violence. So why haven't we gone bust yet? After all, the world looks pretty peaceful to me. Girard responds, don't confuse the lack of the actuality of violence with the lack of the potential for violence. Violent energies have been building up and increasing, but they've been contained and productively channeled, for now, by two new institutions of modernity. The first institution is capitalism. Capitalism is the channel that absorbs and productively directs violence. Now let me be clear that when Girard says that capitalism is a channel for violence, he doesn't have in mind, whipping slaves to build the pyramids, but that the same violent competitive energies of glory, of pride, of desire for conquest are the dominant ones driving capitalism today. Girard reminds us, I quote, "It is not by chance that the European aristocracy went into business once heroes and warriors went out of style," end quote. Girard's point is that when we peek behind the motivational curtains of actors in capitalism, we shouldn't expect to find a desire to help others. We shouldn't even expect to find a materialistic greed. Instead, what people are really after are the same social goods: recognition, honor, prestige, glory. The princes and heroes of yore who would have amassed armies now find themselves competing to make products and services. Girard warns us such. Don't be fooled by the altruistic aims that capitalistic actors so desperately advertise. It's the same drive that drove Achilles to kill Hector, that drove Germany to invade France, that drove Caesar to capture Vercingetorix, that underpins our world economy today.
It's funny, you're referencing ancient stories there, but even today, I'll look at my friends who are successful entrepreneurs, and a shocking percentage of them were criminals in high school.
Right.
And I think that the same energy that drove them to be criminals, what capitalism does is it redirects that energy towards entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And I think this is both a deep critique of capital, right? That it's fundamentally driven off these spirited, irrational forces, but also a deep praise of capitalism, right? What a miracle it is today that people who seek revenge, who seek glory, who seek domination, who seek an outlet for their criminal energies have to do so. Not by killing millions in zero-sum wars as people have done for thousands of years, but they have to compete in making better products and services for others. What a miracle. Girard's analysis on capitalism is deeply ambivalent. Now, capitalism can only properly function in this way when it is supported by law. Law is the second important institution of modernity that contains violence. For Girard, law only works in situations where there's an entity with a monopoly over violence that can arbitrate between disputing parties. Law does not bring about peace through catharsis, nor are the edicts of law justified on the prestige of some deity. It keeps peace by threatening you with more violence. If you, the injured party, aren't satisfied with the outcome of a trial and seek private vengeance by killing or hurting the criminal who injured you, then the state, right, will come after you and punish you with more violence. Law only functions when there is such a powerful entity with a monopoly over violence that can easily overpower disputing parties. That's where its efficacy stems from. This is why, within a single nation, laws are often inviolable and sacrosanct. Yet between nations, right? Think the laws of the UN or the Geneva Convention. Mm-hmm. These laws, without an entity, without a monopoly over violence, are so often transgressed with little consequence. For Girard, capitalism is this bubbling stew of violent competitive energies that must be contained by law if that violence is not to overflow. That is why Girard thinks the dike will break where capitalism intersects the weakest points of law in between nations, in global trade. Mm-hmm. Global trade is where national pride and competitive energies are piled up, yet there is no monopolistic force of violence to arbitrate law between parties. Under this light, Let me read you Girard's startling predictions 15 years ago once more. He said this again at the height of Sino-American optimism, when popular wisdom all believed that relationships between China and the US would only get better through trade. I quote to you again, "A conflict between the United States and China will follow. Everything is in place, though it will not necessarily occur on the military level at first. Trade can transform very quickly into war. From this point of view, we can reasonably fear a major clash between China and the United States in the coming decades." Now, if such a war between colossal nation states were to actually happen, it could very well be the last war. With the invention of nuclear weaponry, Girard thinks we genuinely do live in an apocalyptic moment where the entire world can go up in flames in mere minutes. What is unique about the nuke isn't its singular destructive force, right? The firebombing of Tokyo, the Mongol mass murders, I think are all comparable to the devastation of a singular nuclear strike. What is unique about the nuke is that it forces rivals to utterly destroy each other at the first glimpse of provocation. Unlike firebombing or a Mongol horde that takes time to maneuver through terrain, there are no frictions to unleashing your entire nuclear arsenal. Before the nuke, nations fought wars like a boxing match, taking time to maneuver, resting in between, with fatal blows rare and often taking a very long time. The nuke allows nation states to fight wars like a duel, an instant and fatal escalation. In many ways, it's worse than a duel because it allows the dead party to shoot the person who is alive. Even if you nuke my entire landmass into oblivion, my nuclear submarines can still avenge me post-mortem. This is what it means by mutually assured destruction. Framed in this light, Girard's worries of apocalypse is less theological speculation than déjà vu. On October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo was located and targeted by an American carrier group, dropping signaling depth charges, essentially like underwater bombs, intended to destroy the submarine. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the crew in that submarine had completely lost contact with Moscow for days and thought that a new world war had broken out. They were debating and considering whether to fire the nuke, believing that they were under direct attack. Now, this submarine required all 3 senior officers to agree to launch the strike. 2 of them decided to do so. Only one officer's stubborn refusal prevented an almost certain nuclear attack and likely Armageddon. This is how close we were. The will of one man was all that stood in the way. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the specter of apocalypse has long faded from the public imagination. But Girard prophesizes that this ghost of yore will soon return to haunt us once more. If the end of the world had a beginning, I think we could do far worse than attributing it to the invention of the nuclear bomb. So how ought one live in the end times? With apocalypse around the corner, what ought one do? Girard's answer is brief as it is unsatisfying. Withdraw. Withdraw from the world. Leave it all behind. Tend to your own garden. There's nothing you can do to stop apocalypse. You're only going to muddy your own moral character by trying to get involved in such a mess. Withdraw. Stay away from it all so that you can nurture your soul. The kingdom of God will not be established here on earth, but perhaps we can preserve ourselves to be worthy of it in heaven. On November 4th, 2015, Girard passed away peacefully in his home in Stanford, California at the age of 91, leaving us in deafening silence, stranded in an apocalyptic moment with nothing but the advice to withdraw. This is how Girard's story ends and where our lectures will also come to a screeching halt. Hopefully, I've given enough reason already to engage with Girard and continue with these lecture series. I fear that as time progresses, Girard will prove to be, if you'll entertain another metaphor, a seismograph of history, able to feel the slight tremors that would balloon to tectonic shifts before others even know that we are standing on a fault line. Girard begins his final work as such. This is an apocalyptic book. It will become more understandable with time because, unquestionably, We are accelerating swiftly towards the destruction of the world, end quote. Unfortunately, his most unlikely prediction of worsening Sino-American relationships has already been made more understandable with time. On the topic of apocalypse, I desperately hope Girard is wrong, but I fear that he is right. If he is right, then Girard is worth engaging because he is one of the only guys to help us navigate the end time, one of the few Virgils left who still take apocalypse literally and seriously. However, I would be a deceitful merchant of ideas if I also didn't share with you why you shouldn't engage with Girard or continue with these lectures. There's a common metaphor given about philosophy. Philosophy is often compared with medicine, that it has the power to cure our souls and societies, and I think that's a quite apt metaphor, but just not taken far enough. Because just as medicine has side effects, so do philosophies. And I wish that philosophers wrote on the side of their books the unwanted side effects of their philosophies as pharmaceutical companies did on their drugs. Warning: disdain for the material world if you take too much of these Platonic dialogues in one sitting. Caution: more than one dose of Nietzsche a day makes patients with pre-existing health conditions descend into uncontrollable rage. Side effect: erectile dysfunction if you take these Buddhist sutras too seriously. Attention: inability to form coherent sentences if you read too much Adorno in one sitting. Just as a drug will course through your veins and infiltrate your entire system, Girard's ideas will latch themselves onto your psyche and colonize your worldview. So we must ask, what are the side effects of engaging Girard? I've presented to you the red pill, but as any honest merchant, I must also tell you why you should take the blue pill instead. The likely but not necessary side effects of Girard are threefold. First, alienation. Girard will likely show your most intimate, long-held desires, ones that your entire identity have been staked on, as external and alien. The career you've always wanted since you were 4, the type of person you wanted to marry since childhood, the political cause that you've dedicated your life to, your core desires will likely be thoroughly alienated and shown to be external and perhaps even perverse. Mimetic theory could also alienate you from others. From this point going forward, you will have trouble fully participating in any political or collective activity, always aware of the deceitfulness of mimesis and the madness of crowds. Second, inaction. Girard is the most ambivalent writer that I've ever come across. What should we do with the scapegoating? Well, on one hand, it's a huge lie. You're killing innocents. But on the other, it is the only way that pagan societies have brought peace. Should we fight to remove caste systems? Well, if you don't, then you will subject people to arbitrary distinction, meaningless oppression, grounded on nothing but lies. But if you do, you open them up to competition of all against all. Metaphysical desire will burn through their communities and set it ablaze. Should we participate in capitalism? Capitalism is a competitive cesspool of violent energies that has brought about the most lovely, prosperous, and peaceful society known to date. If you are looking for clear-cut answers, or even answers at all, you've come knocking on the wrong door. Go to a Marx or Hegel instead. The extreme ambivalence in all of Girard's ideas, in addition to his deep pessimism on the human condition and history, tends to incapacitate those who've digested them a bit too thoroughly. Third, and certainly not least, the side effect of Girard is hopelessness. By now, the point should be familiar. Apocalypse is imminent. There's nothing you, nor I, nor anyone can do about it. If you do wish to remain hopeful after understanding and digesting Girard, just know that that hope is going to have to come from you and not Girard. You are going to have to dig yourself and all of us out of this apocalyptic hole. Girard really has nothing left to offer. Turn back while you still can. I have warned you thus. Now, to those stubborn or perhaps morbidly curious enough to continue, I can only heed one last time against continuing on these lectures by echoing what Dante inscribed on the gates of hell. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here.